Live. All right, and we're live. Hello, everyone. As you might have noticed, there's a lot of misinformation about ivermectin going on. I mean, a lot. We've got some bombshells for you. Now, warning ahead of time, if you want to be part of a circle jerk, the Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity crowd where you're only hear what you want to hear, turn back now. But if you want to know what's really going on about ivermectin, and I hope you do, stay tuned because, like I said, we got some bombshells. Today, I've got Gideon, the health nerd. He's a writer and epidemiologist, and he's really been doing a good job debunking and researching, digging in deep to the evidence of the pro-ivermectin crowd. So, Gideon, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Good to be here.
So first question is, so what is an epidemiologist and how did you get interested in ivermectin?
Epidemiology is basically the study of human disease. Before COVID-19, my work was exclusively in the realm of chronic disease. So I mostly worked in diabetes research. And I got, obviously, as everyone did, pulled into COVID during this pandemic. And ivermectin, I first became interested in ivermectin last year, actually, because I was somewhat involved in uncovering the Sergio fraud. So for people who don't remember, the Sergio was the company that claimed to have this database that couldn't exist. They claimed to have this massive database of hundreds of hospitals across the world. And I noticed, I saw people looking at it on a statistical forum and noticed that the numbers for Australia were literally impossible at the time, and sent that to some journalists who then looked into it more deeply. So, and Sergio, everyone remembers the big papers in the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet, which were retracted, that were on cardiac medication and on hydroxychloroquine. But few people now remember that they also published a preprint on SSRN, which is a preprint server, that found very large benefits for ivermectin. And in fact, the reason that ivermectin is so commonly used across the world, particularly in Latin America and developing countries, is based on that preprint, which was obviously withdrawn because it was fraudulent. So that's the first contact I had with ivermectin as a COVID treatment. I mean, it's an antiparasitic drug that I vaguely knew about prior to the pandemic, but didn't really. I mean, working in chronic disease, there's not much scope for antiparasitic medications.
So the most recent misinformation about ivermectin is about these hospitals in Oklahoma being so packed that they couldn't, packed with ivermectin overdoses, that they had to turn away gunshot victims. Now, currently, that certainly appears to be a fraudulent claim now. Two of the hospitals that the doctor who made this claim works at have come out with statements saying that they are not aware of any ivermectin overdoses at their hospitals. The third hospital that we know he has worked at hasn't commented yet. So, I mean, certainly it seems that this is an example of the mainstream media's showing their bias, that they are anti-ivermectin because they associate it with I mean, I'm assuming it's probably partly because they associate it with the anti-vax community or just the general right-wing community, which, a lot of mainstream outlets are just biased against. So, well, what were your thoughts on this finding? This
I mean, I shared this particular story myself, and then added a tweet underneath saying it's just one guy's opinion, so definitely not verified fact. Because I don't know.
And I want to hold on. I want to tell you something. It was like not even an hour later, I think, where you followed up with that important tweet, and then later it was discovered that your intuition was correct.
Yeah, I mean, I was at the time bouldering, so I wasn't paying a huge deal of attention to Twitter, but I did think it was important to clarify. That being said, I mean, I think the reason why it went viral is very simple. It's too good a story to pass up on. And if someone else, as the media world works, if someone else has reported on it, then it's fair game, basically, because you can always say, well, as someone else reported, and then if they're wrong, well, it's not you being wrong, it's them being wrong. And it's regardless of your position on ivermectin, hospitals filling up with overdoses would be, you know, a startling finding. I think I was also a bit primed because we have had several, I know of several overdose cases in the hospitals I work at. So it's not like this is a complete unknown phenomenon. I think really what's happened is one dude has probably heard a rumor, and then he's treated that as established fact, and then the Rolling Stone treated it as established fact, and then it exploded everywhere.
Yes, and you bring up a good point that, you know, people can still take too much ivermectin, and I believe like Poison Control has a database, and their number was something like 500 in the whole country. So that's really, you know, that's not nearly on the scale that that these recent articles have made it seem. I think they said that it's increased by like something about 1,000%, but since it's very hard to overdose on ivermectin, 1,000% increase from the baseline of like 5 people to 500 people, something like that. So what does happen if someone takes too much ivermectin?
I actually don't know what the kind of lethal symptoms are. I think the main symptom is nausea and vomiting if you take too much. But I haven't.
Which seems like pretty, which doesn't seem so serious, but obviously nobody, you know, we don't want to put anybody in a position where they get, you know, start vomiting if there's no reason for them to be taking it in the first place. Okay. Also, hey, okay, before we get into debunking some more misinformation, which everyone needs to stay tuned for, I'm curious what your opinion is on the Joe Rogan story. So did you hear that Joe Rogan just got COVID, and he treated it with pretty much everything available, including ivermectin? So did you have any thoughts on how that was covered, or just him taking ivermectin? Do you have any opinion on that?
As an Australian, I tend to pay less attention to the American news than some people might. I don't really know much about Joe Rogan, I'll be honest.
Well, just a celebrity taking ivermectin to treat their COVID.
I think that there are a lot of people who currently believe ivermectin works, and I think that they are relying on evidence that is put together by organizations promoting ivermectin, and I think those organizations are relying on evidence that in large part is fraudulent. So I think the fact that a celebrity would take ivermectin is no more or less worrying than the fact that millions of people across the world are taking ivermectin to treat COVID based on evidence that is not great.
Okay. Now, with that said, let's jump into a huge study, ivermectin study in Argentina. And I'm going to play the clip of Dr. Corey talking about it in the Senate hearing. And then you tell us what we know now. Okay. How's that?
Just mention that
I was. Here we go. Oh, now before I play this, actually, are you familiar with Dr. Corey's testimony before he recommended ivermectin? Maybe 5 months, I think, or 6 months before he recommended ivermectin, he recommended some kind of steroid.
I think it was methylprednisone that he believed was the most effective. It's a corticosteroid.
Okay, and that was proven to be effective versus COVID, correct?
Yeah, so I believe he was arguing for the use of corticosteroids generally. The one that was most effective in the recovery trial is dexamethasone, famously. It's very commonly in use now, but it's the same class of medications. He was saying this class of medication should be used more, I believe. To be honest, I will say I don't know that much about Pierre Corey. I haven't really looked into his history or him as a person.
I just wanted to mention that because, well, in addition to him starting the clip, mentioning it himself, I think it's important, you know, in hindsight, looking back, he is a credible doctor. He has a good background. He recommended this steroid to help treat COVID before it was approved by the national health institutions. And now it is, you know, standard operating procedure to use that in certain COVID cases. So I just want people to understand that. And here we go into the clip.
You just mentioned that I was here in May and I touted I wouldn't say touted, I recommended that it was critical that we use corticosteroids in this disease when all of the national and international healthcare organizations said we cannot use those. That turned out to be a life-saving recommendation. I am here again today with a new recommendation. Mountains of data have emerged from many centers and countries around the world showing the miraculous effectiveness of ivermectin. It basically obliterates transmission of this virus. If you take it, you will not get sick. I want to briefly summarize it. Number one, we have evidence that ivermectin is effective not only in prophylaxis, in the prevention. If you take it, you will not get sick. We just came across a trial last night from Argentina by the lead investigator of ivermectin in Argentina, Dr. Hector Carvalho. They prophylaxed 800 healthcare workers. Not one got sick.
All right. So Gideon, there's been a bombshell story that suggests that was a likely fraud. Gideon, how did you react to that when you first heard that, and what have we heard recently?
Well, so, I mean, this is the first time I've heard that testimony. As I said, I don't really follow American politics at all.
Well, you did hear about the study, right? Okay, you heard about
the study. People started sending it to me in, I think they probably started sending to me after that testimony, actually, because that was in February, right?
I think the testimony was December of last year.
Okay. So I started getting...
but it got censored in January and continued to be censored. So, that got it more news. Of course, this is one of the reasons I'm against censorship on principle, but I'm also against it because I don't think it even helps. But mainly on principle. Anyway, I started
getting that study in maybe January, February. People started sending it to me because I had talked a little bit about ivermectin. Actually, people started sending it to me mostly because I talked about other things. I hadn't really looked into ivermectin very much at that point. And they said, look at this amazing study. And at that point, when I first read it, I just thought no one could ever believe this to be true. No one could ever believe that this study is evidence of anything. It was an observational trial. So, I mean, you've got classes of studies. The randomized control trial tends to be the best because we take the most effort to make sure that it's that the results reflect the answer to our question. The next step down is a sort of observational cohort study where you put people into groups, but you choose them in a non-random way. So in this case, they didn't actually say, and so observational trials, how you divide people into groups is one of the most important things. For example, if you ran an observational cohort study and you divided people into groups based on their likelihood of getting COVID, so you had one group who you gave ivermectin who you thought were unlikely to be exposed to the disease and one group who were likely to be exposed to the disease, that wouldn't be a good study at a very basic level. And so this was an observational cohort study, not the best quality of evidence. And also they didn't say how they put people into their groups. They didn't say it at all. Moreover, the graphs were not just poorly made, they were bizarre. If you look at the graphs in the study, they've got 3 bars, and the third bar doesn't actually correspond to any group. It's just a floating number. So what they've clearly done is they've highlighted too many cells in Excel. It's what happens if you accidentally do that. It creates another series when you don't actually have the series. And then the tables, they've got a table in their results where the totals don't match up to the numbers in the table. If you just add up the numbers, it gives you a different number to the number at the bottom. They posted their results in 2 places. They posted it in this study that they published, and also on a pre-registration database, which is an American pre-registration database. And on the pre-registration database, they posted different results to the study. And also, just at face value, the paper was reviewed in a week, which is not a good sign. So the peer review process took less than 7 days from start to finish. It doesn't meet any of the marks of quality you'd expect in a scientific paper. The typesetting is poor. The language is weird. They don't talk about how they got funding for the study. They don't talk about where they recruited people from specifically. You recruit over 1,000 people. They have to come from a lot of places, and they don't talk about which wards, which services. It just looked like a study that no one could ever believe. No one would ever look at that and go, that's good research. And so now, after a very lengthy investigation by Stephanie Lee and the team from BuzzFeed, and also, I looked into a lot of this myself personally, and Kyle Sheldrick was also involved. He's an Australian doctor. We have, the result is that the study almost certainly did not take place as described. Whether it took place at all is still in question. I mean, the Dr. Carvalho does appear to have been given some ivermectin by a pharmaceutical company, and he also did register he does have an ethics approval for one of the sites. So maybe there was some research here, but basically the results that they have posted seem almost certainly to be fabricated.
And I really, so you say nobody could look at this study and understand it. And I think obviously the problem is, people like myself who, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a statistician. So, most people just trust the authority, right? And so even if people are skeptical of, the FDA, right? We can still fall prey to, just trusting authorities like Dr. Corey in his doctor's outfit. And like we said before, he is credentialed and he has been correct in the past. So anyway, but I wanted to mention, you pointed out how some of the tallies, some of the totals didn't add up. And so even, if you're an idiot like me, if you did dig in a bit, you could see that, an elementary school student can do this level of math. I challenge everybody, anyone, just look at it. Add up these columns. They don't add up.
Pretty much. It should be, the totals at the bottom should be 132 and 99 based on the numbers in the columns.
Yeah.
So they've got it, their totals wrong.
Yeah. And also for those, people might not have caught it, but in Corey's testimony, this is the study that he started with. So this was, the strongest evidence to him. And understandably, it's definitely the most dramatic results. But he also mentioned that he had just heard about it the night before. He said that. That's how he started it. So he obviously didn't, dive into it carefully. Okay. So it turns out it's fraudulent. What else do you want to say? Anything else?
Oh, yeah, look, we still don't, we may never know exactly what happened there, but yeah, some of the hospitals involved said that they have no record of the study. So yeah, the study does not appear to be on the level. I will say that I don't see how anyone could have been unskeptical of this study. At a very basic level, the 100% benefits are basically never seen in anything. There is no drug that has 100% benefit for anything. One of the most astonishingly effective medications we've discovered ever is antiretroviral treatment for AIDS and for HIV. And that has a 99% or it has a 90-odd% benefit in the survival benefit for AIDS. So it prevents 90% of deaths, which is massive, huge, amazing, world-changing stuff. And even that wasn't 100%.
So, and honestly, like this, that didn't even occur to me. I wasn't aware of it's so obvious when I hear someone say it. And I heard people make this case, and that's one of the reasons I found you and wanted to have you on. So, okay, everyone, wait, there's more. Wait, there's more. So let's go into, let's briefly talk about the El Ghazar thing, and then we'll go into the big website. El Ghazar study. Tell us the significance of that and why that's fraudulent or likely fraudulent as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, El Ghazal, we can probably say with more certainty is fraud because it's been over 2 months and the investigators have failed to have any real response at all. That study, I mean, I looked at it and I said, well, this also isn't very good quality research. They didn't report how they concealed allocation. I mean, you know, there's a list of things that you go through that I still have this list from my master's degree in public health nearly a decade ago. When I first did it, and I still look back at that, and of these elements that you look at for quality in randomized control trials, and they fail most of them. So when you look at it, it's not a very good study. But also, this student, Jack Lawrence, this master student from England, he read through it and he realized that basically the entire thing is plagiarized, and they just copy pasted from other studies and put it into their research.
I want to hear more, but first, I just want people to understand. I need to preface this. This is the study. So other than the Argentina study, this was the biggest randomized control trial, or the most influential randomized control trial because it had the most positive results, positive for ivermectin.
Yeah, it was both the biggest and the most influential at the time. I mean, in May, you know, there was a smattering of very small studies that hadn't really looked at mortality, and then there were 2 studies that had looked at mortality. There was this study, El Ghazal, and another study called by a Dr. Niai from Iran. And El Ghazal basically found a 90% mortality benefit. So it found that giving ivermectin to people who are sick with COVID reduced their risk of dying by 90%. And because it included so many people, it impacted all of the recommendations, and it impacts the meta-analyses. So meta-analysis is when you take a lot of studies, you put them into a single statistical model that produces a weighted mean, and it weights bigger studies higher than it weights smaller studies by design. So this study not only impacted the recommendations, it was also big because it changed the meta-analysis conclusions. And I mean, long story short, Jack managed to get a copy of the data set that they used for this study, and it's the fakest data set that I've ever seen. And the only response, and the data set was under a link on the study which said, this is our data set. And the only response that the authors have got so far that I've seen publicly is, that wasn't our data set. But they haven't released another data set. They haven't made any statement other than, no, that's not our data. That fake data, no, that's not our data. Even though they said it was before everyone realized it was fake. And
the reason it looks fake is, I mean, there's duplicate entries. I mean, how can you describe
there
it?
Are so many. Nick Brown has a brilliant blog that you can go through. He's one of the most detailed fraud detection people that I've ever met. He goes in incredible detail, and you can actually download his code and replicate everything he's done. So I encourage you to do so if you're skeptical, but it doesn't take very long to realize that it cannot be data from a real trial. If you filter, the first thing I did when I got the file was just filter and look at all the people who died and look at the dates of their death. And the dates of their death are mostly before the study was meant to have started. Can't be real. Simple. 20 seconds. This cannot be actual data from the actual trial that they did.
Yeah.
And since they can't produce real data, we have to, but also the data matches the study quite well. So the means and standard deviations and stuff of other things are the same. So it is the data set they used, and the study probably is fraud. And the issue with that study, so if I go back to these meta-analyses, if you take this fraud out, what you're left with is, depending on precisely how you run your model and precisely which studies you include or exclude, you're left with a benefit from randomized control trials that's either completely non-existent, or either crosses that line of statistical significance, or is just marginally statistically significant. But it's entirely based on another study, this other study I mentioned, Niai et al. And that study is incredibly low quality, and also we have very big worries about, because they have completely refused to give their data to anybody. So we've emailed the authors for that study, and they have refused to give us data. They've also refused to respond to the journal that the study is now published in to give them data, as far as I'm aware. It's a really big red flag at this point for any study of ivermectin with benefits, or even without benefits, any study of ivermectin, that refuses to give their data. But I will say that I don't think a single study that hasn't found a single of the null studies has refused to give us their data. Most of them, it's actually quite
null
amazing.
Studies, meaning it doesn't show, it shows neutral or no effect.
It's quite fascinating. If you email people and say we'd like to check your studies for fraud, the people who have not committed fraud very quickly send you their data because they are very worried, and the people who you're worried about, they start insulting you and saying, "How dare you ask me for my data?"
Yeah, and let me just quick thought experiment for everyone. If you had data showing a solution, a cheap, affordable solution to COVID-19, you would want to share that fucking data, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, something about the Carvalho study that someone pointed out was that Dr. Carvalho doesn't act as if he found a perfect cure for COVID. He said, I think his public statement was that I want this to be considered as one of the drugs that we use, not necessarily the only drug. But if you found a drug that worked 100% of the time, that's not what you would say. You would say, we need to use this drug for everything now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I would say. I don't know.
Well, that's what Dr. Corey said when he, because he was convinced of these studies.
Exactly.
So, okay, let's hit on actually, let me ask you, Tess Lawrie is one of the biggest advocates of ivermectin. She removed the El-Ghazar study, and she says it didn't make a difference in her meta-analysis, and says that in her meta-analysis, ivermectin still works. So what do you say to that?
Well, I will say that she's been rather rude to me publicly, which I always find odd. People accusing me of having conflicts, being paid by the pharmaceutical industry. I wish I was paid by someone to do this work. I do this on weekends, after hours, and in my lunch break. I mean, when else do I have time to actually look into ivermectin? God.
Sorry to cut you off. You mentioned you go into Tess Lawrie, but I have to say that is such an important part. You are not getting paid to do this. The media that does get paid to do this, they really didn't do a good job debunking this stuff. Now, they reported that, there is no evidence to support these claims. They've said that, but that's not really doing a good debunking. That's not going to convince anybody, because anybody who's, heard about these studies is going to hear that no evidence and say, hold on, there is evidence. I heard about evidence. So really the proper way to fact check this is to do what you and Jack have done and really just dive deep and say, this is bullshit because X, Y, and Z. Really.
I guess I do think, doing what we do is very difficult, generally speaking. I mean, adding up tables, that's one thing, but emailing authors, understanding responses, being able to do statistical analyses to try and figure out if papers are potentially fraudulent can be quite difficult. And some of the stuff that I do to check for quality, I couldn't do before I did my master's degree in public health. So I feel sorry for journalists who like if they go to an infectious diseases expert who also probably is not equipped to look for fraud, and the infectious diseases expert says, well, I don't think there's any evidence for it. I can see why you wouldn't necessarily go in and start trying to get data files.
No, I understand too. I mean, it's a lot. It takes some effort, takes some work, takes some knowledge, like you said. But
but I mean, no one does this. It's not just journalists who don't do this. The scientific community doesn't do this. The people who've published meta-analyses on ivermectin, who've aggregated this research and written entire papers based on these other papers, they didn't look for fraud either. It took a master's student, two random dudes from Australia, the CFO COO of a bio-wearables company in the US, and a retired guy in Spain, to look into this. No one does this.
Yeah,
no one gets paid. You don't get any kudos or you don't get anything from the scientific community. People hate you for doing this. The wrong people are getting paid. I don't know. I think a basic income might be a solution, a partless solution, so because everyone's enabled to help out in this way if they can. Anyway, what we've suggested is that universities should pay people to look into potential fraud, because otherwise you need the backing of an institution. The reason why all of us outsiders are the only ones who look at fraud is because if you're an academic who looks at fraud, you burn your career. You get hounded out of academia. You will not find positions. We're fortunate enough, most of us, that we aren't in a retired guy, an epidemiologist who works. Well, I do have a university affiliation, but I have other options available to me. A medical doctor. We've got options other than academia. But if you do this as an academic, unless you're a senior professor, you torch your career. Absolutely.
I have to say, okay. Like you said, this is a big problem. Even the science community doesn't fact check themselves, their own community as they should. A hilarious example of that, other recent news outside of ivermectin. So this is not just ivermectin. There's a book called The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and it's by a guy I really like, Dan Ariely. He's been in the New York Times. Has had his books reviewed and recommended by the New York Times. He's had multiple TED Talks, and turns out in that book, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, there was some fraud in at least one of the studies. So it's pretty amazing. Anyway, that was a little bit of an aside, but please add anything you want. And I cut you off when you were going to explain why Tess Laurie's analysis still says ivermectin is effective.
Yeah, so look, I can't claim to have looked at the exact data that she's relying on, but when I rerun that exact analysis myself, taking the papers from her study, and I exclude Alcazar, and I include the two newer trials, the Vallejos et al. And the Together trial that have recently come out. I published this in a blog. They're running a dersimonian and lead random effects inverse variance model, which is pretty standard for this sort of analysis. So I do the exact same thing. It's very simple. People think meta-analysis is this complex process, but it's just a weight. All you're doing is calculating a weighted mean. You're just adding all the numbers together and getting an average. But instead of getting a specific average, you give them percent weight. So bigger studies count more towards your final number. Anyway, I rerun their model, and if I don't include the two newer studies, what I find is that they have this result verging on significance. So, p equals 0. Or it's just significant. It's like p equals 0.04 or something. If you include either of the newer studies that have recently come out since they published their analysis, it crosses that line of significance for mortality. But the problem is, as I said, it relies entirely on this Niai et al. Study, which we are very worried about. And even this Niai et al. Study, even if it's not fraud, and I'm not saying it is, but it is transparently low quality. So my colleague Kyle Sheldrick, Dr. Sheldrick, who was involved with both the Carvalho and the Alcazar kind of investigations, he's publicly commented on Niai et al. And said that the baseline variables are not consistent with a truly randomized study. And I agree. I think that if the study did happen as described, assuming it did, and it probably did at this point, well, we don't know, but let's assume it did, it cannot have been properly randomized based on the results they report. So if that's true, and you're basing your entire mortality benefit on that study, there's a big problem. So I think what we can correctly say at this point, in my opinion, I can't claim to speak for Tess Laurie or the what are they, the British Ivermectin something group, Bird, yeah, British
Ivermectin something,
yeah. Bird, who have publicly said accused me of being paid by the pharmaceutical industry.
Yikes.
Yeah, wonderful people. Strange accusation. Anyway. If I rerun what they say they've done, I get a result that is either not significant or it's just verging on significance and relies entirely on a study that I think is extremely poor quality, even if it is not fraud, and whose authors have refused to send data.
Okay, so that's a meta-analysis determining whether it has an effect on mortality.
Yes.
Right? All right. What about as a preventative treatment?
So there are relatively there are relatively few prophylaxis randomized trials. Most of the prophylaxis literature are these extremely poor quality observational studies. And also there aren't as many prophylaxis studies. Like in the real world, it's quite hard to run a prophylaxis study because you need quite a lot of people in your prophylaxis study to make it effective. There's one study where the authors have said, oh, we'd love to send you our data just so you can see it's not fraud. And then when we replied, yes, sure, please do send us your data, they were like, oh, no, you need to contact the lead author to get your data. It's just odd. I mean, I'm not saying that they haven't sent through the data. It's just a strange interaction. Yeah. But there's also, I will say, at least one more fraud in the prophylaxis literature that's yet to come to light. At least one more, probably two or three. But there are several studies where authors have failed to send us data. There are several studies that are so transparently low quality, again, that it's bizarre that people are relying on them as evidence. But if you look at the RCTs, there's just the confidence intervals are huge. They're massive because there's only one RCT of prevention, really, this Schumann et al. Study that people are really using. And that study, bizarrely, they report, so this is not conjecture, this is literally in the study. They said, okay, so we randomize people 1-to-1. We put one person in the placebo, one in the intervention group. And then after 100 patients, we thought ivermectin's working so well, we can't continue the study as we originally planned. We're just going to put everyone into the ivermectin group. So it's not a randomized trial. It just, by definition, shouldn't be included in a meta-analysis of randomized trials. Currently, it is in the Bryant et al. Meta-analysis from the Bird group.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, just before we move on to this website that you've identified some issues with, what's your current thought? Do you acknowledge, do you feel like ivermectin could still prove to be a preventative treatment for COVID, or what?
Look, if I go by the very strictly by the numbers, if you look at the evidence, there is some evidence that it could be beneficial. The confidence interval crosses no effect. So, if you're thinking about an odds ratio, if it's below 1, then it's effective. It's above 1, it's ineffective. And in this case, it could be either below or above 1. So we don't know if it works. If you think about this, generally, there's a plausible, modest benefit for ivermectin in the treatment of COVID. Prophylaxis, most of the studies are very low quality, so it's hard to say anything conclusive. But again, plausible that it could be effective, certainly. I think some of the biggest studies have excluded very large benefits, so it's unlikely that we're going to see, massive 50, 60, 100% reductions. But certainly there could be some benefit there. That's if I go absolutely perfectly technical by the numbers. If I say, I've now found, we haven't gone public with all cases of fraud, and we will be going public with more cases in the near future. I think that I can confidently say overall that there are 4 studies where there are very serious concerns about whether they were done at all. I'd say that number will at least double, potentially triple, depending on the next few weeks of investigation. So we might end up with as many as 12 studies that just did not occur. That makes me very pessimistic because I don't understand. I mean, I don't know why people have faked these studies. I got sent a fake data sheet the other day for an ivermectin study, and I just looked at it and I took one look at it, 10 minutes, and I was just like, this can't be real. This isn't real data. They've duplicated patients. They've obviously just copy-pasted lines in Excel, and they've copied a line and they pasted underneath, and you can see exactly how that happened. And I just couldn't believe that someone would do that. I mean, why? Who would ever do something that stupid? But they have. There's no way around it. We've now got independent verification that this is definitely the data sheet that the authors used. So that study's fake, and that study is included in meta-analyses at the moment.
But when you say you see a duplicate, you're saying like the column is a complete duplicate, or are you able to look in the document and see their edits, or you just say, you just see a full duplicate?
No, so I mean, imagine a spreadsheet. You've got like a column for one variable. Let's say you've got a column for blood pressure and you've got a column for blood sugar. And in the blood pressure, it's like 110, 111, 112, 113. And in the blood sugar, it's, depending on what variables you're using, let's just say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they've got another block of numbers underneath that, and it goes 110, 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they've got another block, 110, 100, etc.
Wow.
It's just repeating. And there's no way in real data that you get that. And across not just one or two data fields, but almost every numeric field in this data sheet had that same issue. And it replicates the published results of the study exactly. So if you calculate means and standard deviations from this data, you get what they have in their study.
Amazing. Amazing. All right. Now, one thing that you're likely to get if you share some of these revelations of fraud in ivermectin research, you're likely to get somebody posting or sharing a link to this website called ivmmeta.com, which appears to show a bunch of research showing that ivermectin is effective. So Gideon took another dive into that. And what did you find there?
So I've looked at a lot of weird analyses over COVID. There are these various groups who produce evidence. The first thing about, basically, I would say that website is fairly solidly pseudoscientific. It is an example of something that is very convincing to a layperson, but on any closer examination is just filled with mistakes, errors, absolute gibberish. The first issue, I mean, with any of these things, if it's totally anonymous, it's not a good sign. If people are going to do this sort of analysis, they should at least put their names on it. And I find that I cannot believe that so many people have trusted what is 100% anonymous. There's no people's names anywhere on that website. I haven't been able to uncover a single person who agrees that they actually were involved in putting it together. So if they aren't involved in putting it together, why? If they're so proud of their work, why not put their names on it? That site probably gets tens or hundreds of thousands of hits a day, and they aren't claiming credit for it. I mean, it's a bit worrying. But I mean, basically,
it is worrying.
Yeah,
especially because I mean, I'll say when I saw the Corey testimony and I searched for information on ivermectin studies, that's one of the top sites that popped up for me. I don't know if it's still the case, but anyway, so yeah, it is worrying. Go on. Sorry to cut you off.
Absolutely, their SEO is pretty good. Basically, what they do is they take any and all. So before I go into why the issues are so big, I should explain something about meta-analyses. There's this phrase "garbage in, garbage out," which meta-analysts stole from the engineering industry, maths people, which is saying that what you get out of a meta-analysis depends entirely on what you put into it. And that's just a simple fact, because a meta-analysis is literally a weighted mean. So if you average two numbers, if one of the numbers is meaningless, then your end number is also meaningless. If I averaged the heights of 5-year-olds and you're American, so what, NFL linebackers, right? I wouldn't get a meaningful average. It would be a nonsense number, and I couldn't call that meaningful. So it's very important that you check the quality of the included research before you conduct any meta-analysis. That's most of the work. The most simple meta-analysis you can do is just a simple mean, just average. That's a meta-analysis. It's just a bad one. What this site does is it takes every study that they can find, maybe not that's ever been published, but every study they can find, which is quite impressive. They found quite a few studies. They take the number that they find any number in that study that is positive for ivermectin, so where the number looks like it's like ivermectin is working, and they put all of that into one statistical model, and then they report the results. So what you'll see is there's some studies on there that are so remarkably low quality that no one would ever really believe them. All of the studies that we've discussed today, sorry, El Ghazar has been removed, I believe, but both of the Carvalho studies are still up there.
That's the Argentina study?
Yep, as well as another study that we've raised quite substantial concerns about. There are at least 2 studies on there at the moment that I would say are definitely fraudulent, that we haven't gone public with. And I mean, even if you just look, so if you zoom in a little bit, you can see why it's nonsense, why this particular model is obviously nonsense. So what they've done, so remembering that a random effects meta-analysis is essentially just an average that you've weighted slightly. If you look at what they've put into their meta-analysis, so they've got symptoms, the proportion of people who have symptoms in the Ahmed study. They've got the not even the number, the average, the Babalola study, which is a bit below that. They've converted the average of viral positivity. I think that from memory, I can't remember exactly. I think Babalola, they reported CT cycles. So they've converted a mean into an odds ratio so they can average it in this study. They've got the proportion of people who are hospitalized in the Samaha study just below. They've got et cetera, right? So they've taken all of these completely different things and they've put them into one average and then reported that average at the bottom and weighted it with a random effect to meta-analysis. But even worse, if you look at the included studies, what they've done is if a study reports, every study will report a range of things, right? And some of those, if a study is generally null and negative, doesn't find a benefit, they might, let's say they report 10 things. In a negative study, you would expect usually at least one of those things to be positive, one of those, and then the rest to be null, right? What this website does is it goes through all of those 10 things, finds the positive one, and only reports the positive one, regardless of whether the study overall found a benefit for ivermectin or not. And when I say positive, they don't necessarily report the statistically significant finding. What they'll do is they'll pick a number that is the lowest number. So let's say in one group, ivermectin found a 90% benefit, but the confidence interval spanned from 0 to 1.5. That's what they'll take. Because if you add all those together, the meta-analysis produces a lower number.
Yeah, and there's the Carvalho study that we just discussed as likely fraudulent.
So I think that's actually his Carvalho's other study. There are 2 of them on that website. Sorry. So further down in the next block, second from the top there, you'll see Carvalho, the study that we were discussing.
Yes, the early treatment. That's right.
Yeah. And I think they've actually included that study twice, perhaps, because they've got. Oh wait, yeah. So that's the first of the 2 studies that Carvalho reported. Yes, if you look, they've got 2 lines there. So they've got Carvalho, and then they've got Behera, and then they've got Carvalho again. Because Carvalho in that study reports 2 pieces of research, neither of which appears to have happened as described.
All right. Oh, let's see. Where do I find what they? They had a little.
If you switch to the other tab, I'll show you the tab that I the one that I was sharing.
yes. Here you go.
So Kyle. This is my my mate, Dr. Sheldrick, where he actually, someone said, oh well, the study they don't cherry pick anything. So Kyle's like, okay, well let's look at them. Here is prophylaxis studies. If you scroll down a bit. I have to scroll down, don't I? Right? It's my way. Oh, yeah, here we go. Ha! Yeah, I forget these things. Okay, so he went to the study from Prof. Babalola in Lagos, and I can say Professor Babalola has sent us data. Although the study has a lot of issues, I think it's definitely not fraud. So they report a number of symptoms by the rules that the website says it follows. they should go with symptoms in this context, because symptoms are more serious or more severe than viral positivity. You know, we don't really care if you still have virus in your throat if you're still experiencing symptoms, right? As a basic thing. And also the website explicitly says in the case where there are symptoms, we will take symptoms over viral positivity. But in this study, if you look at Babalola, here we go. The authors have decided to use viral positivity instead. So, and in this case, based on cough and dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, the placebo group did better than the ivermectin group on both of those measures. So if you look, the minus means that they lost more, so they were better. They got more better, basically. Mm-hmm. Not statistically significantly, but in this case, placebo beat ivermectin. I mean, it's not quite. That's not quite correct, but you know what I mean.
Well, no. Like they say so. It performed better, but it just wasn't statistically significantly better. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, precisely. And so IVM Meta should have a number on their website that is above 1, so an odds ratio of above 1, because the placebo group is doing better than the ivermectin group on this measure. But instead, they've gone with viral positivity, because viral positivity in the study, the ivermectin group did statistically significantly better than the placebo group.
Okay, yeah, that is very interesting. So it's so obvious they're just cherry picking some data from one study instead of all the data from the study, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
especially even contradicting it. So there's contradictory data within one study, but they're just cherry picking the one part that makes ivermectin look good.
Basically, I mean, that's what they're doing. It's not that there's contradictory data in one study. It's that when you run a study, you expect that the numbers will jump around a bit, particularly if the study is small. If you're honest, you will take the pre-registered primary outcome that the authors say they use, and you'll put all outcomes that are the same together. So you'll analyze viral positivity in one model, and you'll analyze hospitalization in another model. And that's actually what the Bryant et al. Meta-analysis from the Bird group did, because they are actual scientists, not pseudoscientists. But this website just lumps everything positive into one model and says that it works, which is, yeah, it's transparently pseudoscientific.
Okay. And another important point, I think you mentioned already, but just in case, is that they're not including studies that had negative results or null results.
It's not that they're not including them. They do have some studies that have null results. If you look at this screen, you'll see Vallejos and Kraulecki and the Fonseca trial. Simply that what happens is, if possible, they are taking a more positive spin on studies that didn't find a benefit.
Okay. I did find it.
And if you look at that thread, the thread I have on Twitter, you can see I did actually demonstrate this statistically. I mean, for anyone who's interested, they, where was it? It's
something about their p-value, or
I ran an Eggers regression to test for publication bias. Essentially, if you go, no, this is the Carvalho.
Oh wait,
that's the
Carvalho.
Not important. It's not important. Basically, I tested statistically whether this is what you would expect to find, but it's not what you would expect to find if they had been doing this in a reasonable way.
Okay. They did have an interesting section on you, trying to discredit you. Do you want to respond to that? What did that include? Would you like to respond to that, please?
They didn't actually name me. They just said a prominent guy. I don't even. Am I a prominent guy? I'm some dude on Twitter. I mean, don't trust me. Just check.
How did they
rerun
describe
my numbers?
You?
I can't remember.
Let's see. It was pretty funny, I thought. Also, but again, like you said, yeah, it's about the freaking evidence.
And also, I mean, if some anonymous people who run a website that's transparently pseudoscientific want to insult me, well, I mean, that's happened many times before. I had a great deal of anger when I said that you probably shouldn't drink raw milk years ago, so from some people who similarly anonymous. So,
okay. So yeah, it's about the evidence. Gideon could be a supervillain, and it would still be about the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, like they said, what was the one thing they said that I glanced over it. I didn't read it in detail, but they said that I was wrong about heterogeneity. But basically, so what they've got on their website, they describe it as all meta-analyses have heterogeneity. Our meta-analysis can't be bad because of heterogeneity. And then they just describe bias. They describe the explanation they've got is just completely wrong about heterogeneity. You know, heterogeneity is a statistical quality, and it's to do with, well, statistical and theoretical quantity that has to do with how different studies are. And it's what I was talking about. You know, you can't really expect a meaningful result if you combine viral positivity with hospitalization risk with the average number of symptoms people have. The number you get is uninterpretable because it's not the average reduction in any one of those things. It's just a number that you can use to beat people over the head with. So basically their response to me, as I briefly skimmed it, didn't really make sense, and I just ignored it. Mm-hmm. If they want to respond to me in person, might be interesting. If the authors yeah, if the authors of that website are listening, I'd love to meet you and ask why you're doing this. It'd be fascinating to have that conversation.
Yeah. One thing that did attract me to you is that you are clearly open to discussing this with people who disagree with you. You've had some good debates on Twitter, and I've heard offline as well with Eric Osgood, who I talked to last interview I did. Okay, let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Hit us up in the Rumble rants or the YouTube super chats. I will say the Rumble rants pays a little higher percentage. So preferably Rumble, but wherever, we're going to answer your questions if you have them.
I should say I have a modest conflict of interest in that I earn money from my Medium posts, but not from Twitter. So if you want to avoid giving me any money, follow me on Twitter and don't read my Medium posts. Although it doesn't pay me unless I think you get like a sum if it's similar to YouTube. But if paid subscribers read your posts, then you get a small amount of money. So it's
yeah, I've got a Medium blog too, and that the model kind of bothers me. I mean, I understand people should get paid for their work, but if I click on your article, sometimes I can't even see the full article because everyone's only allowed to see however many articles until they're blocked. So it's a normal paywall. It's just a normal paywall, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I started the Medium blog long before they started paying people, and I never expected to earn money from it. So anything I get from that is like it goes towards paying for the SoundCloud membership for my podcast, which I haven't recorded an episode of in 9 months. So that's mostly what I use that for.
And also, just people might find it interesting. While I look through, see if there's any good questions, please send them, everyone. I do want to have them answered by Gideon while we have him. He knows he'll give you a better answer than me. So while I look into that, Gideon, everyone should know, is not just a scientific sleuth looking into ivermectin. He's looked into coffee. I'm sure so we have a lot of coffee drinkers listening, I'm sure. And we're confused because we're always here. Oh, coffee is healthy. Coffee is unhealthy. What have you found, Gideon?
Yeah, it's a subject dear to my own heart. So I spent quite a bit of my spare time for the last 4 or 5 years reading every study that comes out on coffee. My take is that the evidence for coffee being bad for your health is not very strong, and the evidence for coffee being good for your health is also not very strong. The few randomized trials that have been conducted are unconvincing, and the observational evidence we have is also not very convincing. So what I do, I would say that coffee probably doesn't help that much. It probably also doesn't hurt that much. Obviously, for pregnant women, the calculation's a bit different because there's a worry about a very large amount of caffeine can cause developmental defects. But aside from that, and also if your doctor tells you not to drink coffee, don't drink coffee. Always my advice, if you're worried about your health, talk to a doctor because they can provide individualized advice. I can only say I've read studies and this is what they say. But anyway, my point being, I don't think there's much either helpful or harmful about coffee. It's my personal perspective.
All right, here's a question about Uttar Pradesh. That's one of the some of the evidence that people will often bring up. I think Corey has brought up. I should say, in addition to the randomized controlled trials that people bring up to support the argument that ivermectin may be effective versus COVID, another one of the common things people will mention is there's a lot of data analysis from around the world in areas that have adopted ivermectin for some time, and it appears that cases of COVID-19 decline after introduction of ivermectin. So yeah, this guy's asking, Zoidberg asks specifically about Uttar Pradesh. He says, does he know why Uttar Pradesh has no pandemic, even though they are only 5% vaccination with 200,000 plus daily tests?
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that these analyses are always awful. Everyone I've seen so far has just been astonishingly terrible, where they look at kind of ivermectin was licensed in this area and then cases went down. It must be ivermectin. But they actually don't have any measurement of ivermectin use. So one example is this idea that Peru had this massive use of ivermectin and then the cases dropped, and then, they stopped using ivermectin and the cases went up. Actually, if you look at the survey data, Peru, about 30% of Peruvians reported using ivermectin in 2020. And the government only gave out a tiny fraction of those doses. Most people bought their own, it appears. I mean, it's hard to explain how 30% of people can report using ivermectin unless they bought their own in this context. So the analyses based on the government's licensing or not licensing ivermectin or giving out doses are meaningless, because actually what happened was most people purchased their own. The shelves were emptied of ivermectin, and then the government gave out a small number of doses. But so the exposure there is completely unknown. No one actually knows how much ivermectin was being used at any point in that graph. The same is true for Uttar Pradesh. People say, the state officially licensed ivermectin at this point, and after that cases fell. But actually what's almost certain to be true is that people in Uttar Pradesh were using ivermectin long before the state officially licensed it. There was probably a great deal of buying of ivermectin, or even if there wasn't, you don't know if there's use of ivermectin. No one's looked into that question to actually try and find out how many doses were taken by people in the state. The other thing I would say is that when you look at India and you try to say, this is a massive success story, we now know that in India, the death rate from COVID has been extraordinarily high. The challenge is that they don't report deaths. And this was known before the pandemic. So there's a paper that came out recently that said prior to the pandemic, only 30% of deaths in Uttar Pradesh were reviewed by a medical examiner. So 70% are listed as unknown, a death of unknown cause, or are, they're not properly investigated. And so when you say that, so when you look at these states and you look at the excess deaths, so these are just saying how many deaths were there from any cause, you find that their excess deaths were 10, 20, 30 times. Sorry, that's an exaggeration. They were between 4 and 10 times the number of deaths reported by the state in India. And so the death toll in India is now estimated to be somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million people. The very high estimates, I think, are probably unreliable. The 2.5 million is seeming to be relatively solid. Somewhere between 2.5 and 4 seems most likely. So if you take the death toll of Uttar Pradesh, multiply it by 10, something like that, multiply it by 5 to 10, that's the number of deaths that are probably caused by COVID. And that estimate means that there's probably been extraordinarily high rates of infection. And so the explanation of why Uttar Pradesh no longer has an epidemic is probably, I mean, it's very hard to know. And I will say everything that I've said in this is extraordinarily uncertain. And none of these things are well known. And that's why I'm so astonished that people believe these analyses of ivermectin where they haven't even established how many people took the drug. But it seems likely that what's happened is there's been a very large epidemic in Uttar Pradesh. Many people have died, and the remaining people are immune to infection. And that would explain low case numbers, even though there are lots of tests.
How about Mexico?
I haven't looked into Mexico, unfortunately. We're about to put up as a preprint a study where we've looked at serology in low and middle income nations from across the world.
Serology?
Yeah, so this is a test for antibodies.
Okay.
To see how many people have been infected. And what we're looking at is the death rate, the infection fatality rate of developing countries in this paper. And so we've got a lot of estimates from India, only one estimate from Mexico. And I can't say I've looked into it in a great deal of detail. There is that there's that study from Mexico City, which is a bit problematic. But aside from that, I haven't really investigated it at all.
Is this the study that people share it thinking that it appears that the cases have declined due to ivermectin use?
Yeah, so I mean, what the study was they had it's a time-varying cohort study where they compare people before they implemented this intervention with people after they implemented the intervention. And the intervention was these care packages, which included ivermectin. And so they say that fewer people were hospitalized in the group that received the care packages compared to the group that didn't receive the care packages. But I mean, the problem with that is that firstly, they don't really control for a lot of potential confounding factors. Socioeconomic status influences who gets hospitalized and who gets care packages. And it's not controlled for at all in the paper. But also with a time-based cohort, when you're comparing to people in the past, there are a lot of biases that creep in simply by design. So Mexico City had a very different epidemic during those two time periods that they're looking at. It's very hard to say that this group that received ivermectin is similar in important ways to this group that didn't receive ivermectin. So it's hard to know what to make of the result in that study.
Mm-hmm. How about the similar data being shared about Africa and how parts of Africa that were given ivermectin as a part of a WHO program to treat parasites? They or these countries in Africa have less cases of COVID than the other areas of Africa. So yeah.
I mean, firstly, my first point is that people don't even bother to do the very basic effort of looking into the data quality. So there are countries in Africa, there is a country, Tanzania in Africa, that has reported no cases since April 2020 because the president of the country, I haven't actually checked in the last month or two, but for most of the pandemic reported 0 cases because the president of the country said that COVID was a hoax and we will report no more cases.
Is Tanzania in one of those countries that
it is a country that's included in the Africa analysis?
Okay, so it's one of those
absolutely.
countries that has been treated with ivermectin for parasites earlier.
Oh, I mean, I don't even know, but it's just if your underlying data quality has problems like that, how can you trust any of it? But then I think the other thing is, the World Health Organization has given a reasonable number of doses of ivermectin, but no one. There are over 1 billion people in Africa. I very much doubt that the World Health Organization has given even 1% that number of people doses in the year 2020, 2021 of ivermectin. Maybe they've given 1 million, maybe 2 million. Maybe it's a huge program and they've given 10 million. That would be 1% of 1 billion people. And you're saying that one tiny 1% is the reason that the COVID epidemics look different. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's nonsensical. There's no possible way that even if ivermectin was 100% effective, if you only treat 1% of the population with it, there's no way it's going to cause a different pandemic, a different epidemic. So people share these graphs and even the very basic assumptions don't make sense, or these maps, these bizarre maps.
Let me, I'm going to share one of those maps that went kind of viral, just so people who aren't familiar. Okay, so I think, so originally, Robert Malone, I think he may have even been the first one to share this top graph. So ignore the second image for a moment, but yeah, the top graph, it's these blue countries, they're the ones that received ivermectin for parasites. And you can see at the bottom here, much lower cases of ivermectin. The other countries in Africa, they have much higher cases. Now, even so that went viral, but I don't think Robert Malone's follow-up graph, which is this one, showing the second image below, went as viral, but it's pretty important. He says, he's pointing out that this graph at the bottom, or not graph, but colored map at the bottom, shows that the same area that was treated with ivermectin for parasites is also extremely low, has extremely low rates of obesity compared to the rest of Africa. So that could be the factor as well. Basically, I think your point, correct me if I'm wrong, but your point is there's no way that we can tell that it's just the ivermectin because there's so many other factors. Is that kind of your main point?
I'm saying that there's no way we can even tell that the pandemic has not been severe in most of those places because they have incredibly bad reporting systems. So Zambia, which is included in the ivermectin countries, I believe, based on that map. Can you put it up again quickly?
Yeah. Here you go.
It's real hard to read.
Zambia included? Let me try to zoom. I can't even zoom. I failed geography. So
okay. No, I think if I look really closely, Zambia is not an ivermectin country. Okay, so Zambia, they did this amazing study where they randomly took people from the central morgue of Lusaka, which is the capital of Zambia, and they tested those people for COVID. And what they found was that the number of people who had COVID symptoms and a positive COVID test was 10 times higher than the official number of COVID deaths in that location. And they've continued that study over nearly a year, and they found that the issue continues. And so what that means is that the number of COVID deaths in Africa, in many of these places, is probably a very large underestimate. Because they have similarly problematic reporting systems. They don't have many tests in lots of these countries. So when you say that they're doing better, what you're actually saying is, I haven't looked into the underlying data of African countries sufficiently well to say anything about them. And yes, indeed, the other issue is that these countries are different in many thousands of ways. We treat Africa like it's one place, but it's a continent of 36 countries. And Zambia is as different from Benin as Belgium is from Slovakia. They're not identical, even though they are on the same continent. So the idea that you can just say, oh, well, these countries had this WHO program and these countries didn't, and therefore no COVID. So just to me, it just shows that you haven't actually looked at any of the data involved in any of that. And
I'll just say, I did look at the study recently. There's a couple of them that suggest that say, maybe ivermectin is why these areas appear to be having less cases of COVID or lower mortality rates. That's what they predict or conclude that it may. Well, and that's the key thing, is that even in these own studies, they say, they use all these qualifiers like, suggest, may, they're not claiming that it absolutely is the result of ivermectin. But I see a lot of people sharing the information as if it is proof, but even the authors won't say that it's proof. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I mean, for me, the very basic thing that you have to do if you want to do a study like that is get a good estimate of exposure. What that means is you should be able to tell me how many people in each country took ivermectin at what point in that pandemic. Not just, they were part of a UN program, WHO program, and they may have received some doses, but how many doses did they receive? How many of those doses were delivered? How many of those doses were taken in the time period you're looking at? If you can't tell me that, then your analysis is at a very, very basic level meaningless. It's completely meaningless because you might just be correlating things that are completely uncorrelated, and it has nothing, or it's meaningless in terms of ivermectin. It may just be one of 10,000 other confounding factors causing this relationship.
I know at least one of the study tried to control for other factors, but I know, people think that there's that they made mistakes on that. They haven't gone public yet, but
a couple of the published studies have done what they controls of some kind. But my point is, if you don't even have a measure of exposure, then your study isn't. You cannot consider it to be measuring the efficacy of ivermectin. I mean, let's say we ignore all of the other issues with the study of Peru, which is one of the more well-known examples of this. If you ignore all the other issues, they are simply taking government press releases where the government has said we're going to do this thing, and then correlating those with ivermectin. So technically, sorry, correlating those with the outcome of excess deaths. The excess deaths aren't correctly calculated, but anyway, let's just say they're taking government press releases and correlating them with deaths, right? So technically, what they're doing is saying that government press releases are associated with a lower risk of death. I mean, that, and then they're saying that the government press releases are correlated with ivermectin and therefore ivermectin helps. But actually, that's not what they're doing in the analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that brings up a important point. You know, many of the people who believe in ivermectin believe partly because they distrust the U.S. government and the U.S. health institutions and the international health institutions. But, you know, I'll just use this moment, take this moment to remind everyone that, okay, some amount of, it's good to be skeptical of the government, but do not limit that skepticism to one government in the world. You know, and
yeah, I was going to say, I live in Australia. I've never lived in the United States. I have lived in other countries, and I am very skeptical of the US government. The US government has done some atrocious things. I mean, so has my government. But anyway.
All right. Thanks so much for helping everyone, helping me clear this up, addressing the questions, answering the questions. Let's see. Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, maybe something very quick.
Okay.
I do have to run.
Here's a quick one. So, lol, isn't what he is saying apply to vaccine studies then? Question mark, question mark, question mark. So basically, I guess this is just an opportunity to explain your thoughts on the vaccines and why the studies of the vaccines are higher quality than the studies on ivermectin.
Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing is, it's hilarious. If I told you that your car was broken, would you then point to another car and go, but that car's also broken? Or would you go, oh shit, my car's broken, right? I don't understand why people always bring up vaccines when they talk about ivermectin, because if you believe ivermectin works, you should deeply care about potential fraud in the literature or low quality research. Because if the research is low quality and or fraudulent, then your beliefs are based on lies. So who cares about vaccines is my first point. And the second point is, I haven't done this recently because I haven't been paying a great deal of attention to the new literature about vaccines. I read the occasional study, but it's not. I've had my time taken up by ivermectin. But the studies that I have looked at, I haven't yet found a vaccine study that shows very serious signs of fraud. My colleague, Dr. Sheldrick, has. He has raised concerns about a study of the Sputnik vaccine that's published in The Lancet. I can only say that I've looked at the vaccine studies that are used locally, so the AstraZeneca and Pfizer studies, and I cannot find any red flags for fraud. One of the biggest, the kind of most trustworthy thing you can do in science, for me, is admit to a mistake, right? So if a study says, we made this mistake, and this is how it impacts our results, and they report the results both with and without the mistake, that, to me, is a huge tick, because it means that they know that they fucked up, they admit to it, and they tell you exactly how that impacts their results. And AstraZeneca is a great example of this. You know, they had this weird dosing fuck up. They did try to spin it, or the press releases tried to spin it. But in the scientific study, they're like, yes, we made a mistake. This is how it impacts our results. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, but this is what we found. And when I do all the other basic checks, like adding up the numbers in the tables, looking at the percentages, looking for impossible numbers in the manuscripts, I can't find any. Well, whether that makes you trust the vaccines or not, I can't say. I guess that's something of an individual decision. But and AstraZeneca and Pfizer are used in Australia. They're not the only vaccines that you might be interested in taking. So I can't say. I did read the original Moderna paperwork that they submitted, and I read the FDA stuff. I think it was a long time ago now, but I can't give you detailed info about that vaccine.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, and also people have been trying to do this to me on Twitter for a while. They keep saying, "But what about this vaccine study?" And I've yet to find no one has sent me a vaccine study that I can say that has any red flags for fraud so far.
Okay. We know that they have rare, some rare negative side effects, but that's not fraud.
No.
Okay.
And
yeah.
I mean, the side effects are very well described. At this point, we've given the vaccines to tens of millions of people. So we know exactly how much they are risky to your health. And it's much less than COVID. I can say I have researched the risks of COVID, and they are much, much higher than the risks of the vaccine, based on the evidence that I've produced. And if anyone's interested, you're more than welcome to have a look at my Google Scholar profile and read some of those studies.
Awesome. Gideon, thanks so much for being generous with your time. And please, everybody, follow him on Twitter. Check out his blog. Any last words, Gideon?
No, have a great day.
Okay, that's right. You're just starting your day. It's night for me.
I'm gonna go have another coffee.
All right, yeah, that's the time for coffee for you. All right, thanks again, Gideon.
No worries. Cheers.
Cheers. All right, so have a wonderful rest of the evening if you're in the US like me, and have a wonderful morning if you're in Australia like Gideon. Thanks everyone for listening. Peace.